Welcome, everybody. It's time once again for the next chapter with Charlie Hedges, as he explores turning the page on his life and yours.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the next chapter with Charlie. Today, our conversation is with poet and mystic Steve Garnass-Holmes. And in my mind, it's important for you to know Steve holds a much-needed role as what I'm calling a divine elder in the American cauldron of longing for mystery, wonder, and awe, and mostly hope. Steve Garnass-Holmes is a gift to all of us. So let's allow this conversation with him to carry us away in love, in wonder, and in divine mystery. Steve Garnass-Holmes, welcome to the next chapter with Charlie.
Thank you. Great to be here with you.
Yeah, it's always great to chat with you. You're my, I feel like, besides being the friends that we've developed in our friendship, I feel like a friend because I read your poetry every day of the week. I know you don't publish on weekends, but I read your poems. I do not miss your poems. I read it a couple of times and then I listen to it, and it's just beautiful to listen to your reading.
Good.
It's a fabulous job.
Well, it's a fabulous job.
What's that?
It's a fabulous job to have. I love it.
It's interesting. I just heard a podcast. I didn't hear the whole podcast, but with Richard Rodriguez. Are you familiar with filmmaker Richard Rodriguez?
No.
He's quite famous. He did Spy Kids, that would be, but, he did the mariachi movies and several movies that he's become very popular for. And he talked about that a lot of people in life, that the host, Tim Ferriss, asked him, you took time to begin with writing, what are your assets? And so his family and, all of these sorts of things, he wrote his assets. And he says, far too many of us live by what we want, what we don't have, and we don't live by what we have. And I was very moved by that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the secret of happiness. That, to me, that is wealth, to love what you have. And we live in a culture that's designed to make us feel in need, to feel like, to obsess with our wants. That's why advertising is worth all that money, because it works, because we're going to make you want this stuff. And it's a great spiritual discipline to just unhook from that and not have to want so much. I'm good. I've got good stuff here.
It reminds me of the downside of the American dream. There's a beautiful part of the American dream, but after you have achieved a certain aspect of the American dream, then it becomes drudgery. Then it becomes a battle for more. Mm-hmm. And always, I don't have enough. And
well, and it carries the weight of obligation. I have to do this. I'm not happy unless I do this, which really is the definition of an addiction. Something that you can't let go of because you believe that you can't survive without it. You can't be happy without it. And so it's a tough habit to kick. This notion that I will be more happy if I had more stuff, if I had more, and not only material things, but all sorts of privilege, access, resources, esteem, whatever it is that we think we need. And it goes to the root of our psychology. I think that's one of the profound things about the story of Jesus' temptations in the desert. It's not that there's some guy out there in a red suit and a pitchfork trying to trick Jesus into do bad things. He's wrestling with his own actual temptations, like the temptation for power. He wishes that he could just turn stones into bread. And then he has to let go of attaching to that desire for power and say, I'm going to be powerless and I'm going to be okay with that. And he has to let go of having all the kingdoms of the world worship him and say, I'm going to be an outsider and I'm okay with that. And this temptation that he wishes he could just jump off a cliff and angels would catch him and say, if I love people, I'm going to take risks and I'm going to get hurt and I'm okay with that. I'm going to be vulnerable. And those, by the way, are exactly bread and dominion and security are exactly the things that Caesar promises. And it's the thing that our culture promises. You will have power, you will have comfort, you will belong if you buy all this stuff. And so it really taps deep into our psychology because we, as human beings, want power and security and belonging. And it's a really hard work that we have to continually do to let go of that obsession and say, I'm good. I belong to God. My power isn't mine anyway. It's whatever flows through me. And of course I'm not safe. Life is full of hurt. And I accept that. And I find my riches and my joy and happiness in a world in which I am powerless and vulnerable and always subject to not belonging. And I'm okay with that. I'm perfectly happy.
Well, it's almost like we have to be because there is no option. There is no choice. The other choices are, with the mystics, we'll talk about the false self versus the true self. And the false self is that one that I define as power, prestige, and possession. Mm-hmm. And the fascinating thing about that is that we may desire that, but we are never satisfied with it, ever.
Exactly.
There is never enough of those, ever.
Right. And you can see before your very eyes the richest man in the world who doesn't have enough. He's going to get more. It's like
always trying to get more.
Yeah, it never stops. It's because it doesn't actually make you happy. It doesn't actually work.
Kind of reminds me of those who are running our country right now.
Exactly. Yeah. Power and money. Yeah, it doesn't make you happy.
And it doesn't make anybody else around you happy as well.
Exactly. That's the root of all the misery in the world. Just yesterday morning, I looked out my front window, and we have a lot of wild turkeys around here. And there were these two turkeys fighting. And I was like 5 feet from them. They were right outside my window. These two turkeys that are basically just biting each other's face. And their necks are wrapped around each other. And they're like these two wrestling turkeys, if you can imagine that. And it went on for a long time. And they careened around and crashed into things, and nothing could stop them. And I thought, wow, that's what we're like. We're just so bent on having dominion and being in control and being the one who's on top and getting ours. And I thought, for turkeys, I suppose in the end, that's evolutionarily come to be what helps them survive, because one of them gets a mate and one of them doesn't. But for human beings, it's nothing but destructive. That's why we have wars. That's why we have racism. That's why we have any problem. That's why people, do anything they do that hurts other people, because there's this insatiable need for dominion, to be on top, to win. And it's like, if we could just stop that, how much misery in the world would be relieved? And the only way to stop it is to stop it inside ourselves, to say, I will be the first one.
It begins with me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you with Jesus' temptation. For me, and I think, as a theologian, you probably agree that Jesus' ministry really begins with the temptation. Mm-hmm. There is something that occurs to him that is life altering for him. Yeah. That it's not that, we don't know what it was like before, but this set in motion, mm-hmm. A spirit of humility and of service and of giving. And
yeah. Well, in the gospel accounts. When he's baptized, there's this voice from God that said, "This is my child, my beloved, with whom I am well pleased." And there are two sides to that. One is the belovedness, but the other, this phrase, "with whom I am well pleased," is a quotation from the servant songs in Isaiah, which means you got work to do. And I have given you the gifts that you need to do this work. And I think what happens in the desert is that Jesus sets himself free from all of the stuff that would hinder those gifts that he has. That's what sort of opens the door. And until he's set himself free from all of those desires and fears and attachments, he couldn't give the gifts that he's already been divinely given. And he commits himself to a life of that discipline. And he's still at it on his very last day in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he's got to go off by himself and say, "Oh man, I really want those angels now. I really want to be able to jump off, not get hurt. God, I really don't want to do this." And he's got to work through that and say, "Yep, that's what I want, but not what I want, what you want." And set himself free again, so that he can then go through this whole ordeal that's going to be awful, that he could bug out of anytime he wants, but he's going to stay with it because he's set himself free by facing his own desires and attachments.
You know, Gethsemane to me it's a new. I've had new thoughts on the Gethsemane. You know, after I don't know, 40 years of theology, here I am with brand new thoughts on it. And if you ever doubted the hypostatic union, if you ever doubted fully divine and fully human, this is the truly fully human Jesus, who is, you know, when he says, my God, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Jesus, the Son of God, doubts God. Doubts that God is with him, and yet he follows the commandments. This was the task that was given him. This was why he was sent here, was to do this task.
Yeah.
And it was not just it was divinely difficult for him.
Well, and at the same time, if we imagine that Jesus is, in a sense, the voice of God, this is God saying on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" as a revelation to us that we can't say, "Well, God, you just don't know what it's like to be a human being. You don't realize how hard it is. It's easy for you because you're God." And God is essentially on the cross saying, "I do know what it's like. I am there with you. I know what it's like to feel abandoned by God." And of course, the cool thing is that what holds that all together is that this isn't just a spontaneous outcry from Jesus. He's quoting Psalm 21. And so he's sort of bringing the whole spiritual tradition and all the people who have ever cried out to God into him in that moment, and saying, on behalf of all of us human beings, this is how it feels. And it's God who's saying that. It's God who's saying, yeah, it really stinks to feel like you've been abandoned. I get that.
I read an essay. I'm reading this anthology of essays about Lent and Easter. And in the Lenten essay, one of the essays is by Kahlil Gibran. Now, I have no idea what his faith tradition is, but this sounds about as Christian as anything I've ever read. I mean, and he talks about it was during this time of Jesus, during this time of doubting and difficulty, that is where we see the strength of Jesus, and that is what our strength needs to be in these most difficult, challenging, and that's what we're going to talk about today, is the challenging times. In these most challenging times, calls for us to draw upon not just the strength of God, it is depending on the strength of God, but is our strength to depend and continue to depend on God.
Yeah. Yeah. I think part of Jesus's genius was finding the power in his powerlessness. That when I have no more power in my hands, when I am truly empty-handed, I have nothing left except the power of God that flows through me. And that is infinite power. And I think that's how he could do those miraculous things that he did, not because he had some superpowers, but because he was so totally divested of any illusion of having any personal power that the only power left was the power of God. And he was so directly plugged into that. It's like coming to understand that you're a wire. I'm just a little piece of wire, and there's no power in that wire. And when I trust that, then I know. I don't expect great things to come out of that wire. But when I plug that wire into the outlet, it's got all sorts of power. As long as I remember that I don't have the power, I am plugged into the power. I am not the source of the power. I'm just the conduit. And I allow that spiritual power to flow through me. Then I have enormous power. But in order to get there, I have to begin by letting go of any illusion that I have power in my own person. I am powerless.
Tell me, what is it with this knowledge? What is it that what is it that happens in your life, that occurs in your life? What is the process of your everyday experience that leads you to trust this, have this kind of trust in the power of God? You know, because I know people are wondering, these words sound wonderful and great, but there's something physical, tangible, everydayness. There's such an everydayness about you, Steve, that is essential. And what is the everydayness of that for you?
You know, a lot of it is the recognition that there is power in a situation that I don't have to contain or even convey, but just allow to be there. Once at the very beginning of my ministry, I was a chaplain in a hospital for the chronically ill, and there was a patient there who really had a hard time connecting with who I was. I would visit her every day, and I would have to start all over. And by the end, I was there for 3 months. And by the end of the summer, it got to where we could actually have a conversation. And I felt like this was a great victory. And the very last day, I went in to say goodbye to her. And she was tied to her bed, wrists and ankles, with cloth strips. And she was just writhing and moaning and screaming and saying insensible things. And this was in a room with several beds. And there was a nurse there who was just finishing up doing something with one of the other beds. And she saw my reaction when I came in. And she said, "Oh, yeah, she hasn't had her meds yet," and walked out. And I was really young at the time and really didn't understand mental illness. I was just sort of one of these anti-drug purists, and I thought, you mean this person that I've been talking with for all this time, all summer long, is just this sort of drug-induced hallucination, and this is the real Helen? And it so defeated me that I had no idea what to do next. And I just wanted to say, "Helen, I'm going. It's been nice to see you. I'm leaving now. I'll never see you again, but goodbye." I just wanted to tell her goodbye, and I couldn't say it. I was just so stuck. And I literally dropped to my knees, and I was just trembling on the floor with my hands on the aluminum railing of her bed, with my forehead against the stainless steel. And I don't think I said it out loud, but I definitely felt like, I don't know what I'm doing here. And I'm all alone in this. God, I can't do this by myself. And I don't think I heard a voice, but I felt a voice that basically said, "Neither can I. Stay there." So I just stayed there. I just knelt on the floor with my forehead against the edge of her bed for a long time. And I cannot say that she calmed down. I can't say that she reacted in any way to my presence. But after a while, I felt like what needed to have happened must have happened. And I stood up and I said goodbye to her and said a little prayer and left. And felt like, wow, something just happened. And I didn't do anything other than just stay present. And so throughout my life, I've noticed that sometimes there are times when I want to fix a problem or a person or somehow make something happen, and it doesn't work. But if I have the grace to just be present,
to be there,
yeah, and just show up and be present and pay attention and let the power that's there unfold itself. And sometimes it just means listening to somebody and they work through stuff. And then they say, wow, thanks for your help. And I haven't done anything other than listen.
Right. Right.
And sometimes it's just walk alongside somebody who's going through a hard time. And I don't have the power to make them any better, but they have some kind of power in them that my presence unleashes, and they do what they need to do. And I just go, wow, that was cool. I didn't do a thing. So there is
I wrestle with mental issues. I'm bipolar and wrestle, mostly I'm what they call it bipolar 2, which is more depressive, although it's been with the help of, sorry to say this, with the help of meds, I have not had depression for a decade now, just about. It's
nice.
been wonderful. But you know what I found with that? It's like I'm, to show you my problem on substance, and I think I'm an alcoholic. And I used to, and I haven't drank for, like 26 years now.
Wow, nice, good work.
Well, it's really, but it took me 28 years to get 26 because I had 2 years in the middle of it, which I decided to go back and drink again. And that's when I got in all my trouble. But you know what I found, Steve, was 2 glasses of wine did not make me high. They made me normal. Right. I needed help, and that's what meds do. I needed help silencing the voices. Right. I needed help silencing my demons because they would cause me to be chained down to a bed because I was just, the demons were running me, the noise, the voice, all of my hauntings were running me, not the real me. And if you don't abuse medication, then a medication does that. It silences, it quiets, it softens the voices at least.
Yeah, I think what I didn't understand at the time was that some forms of mental illness come from experiences, but some forms come from chemical imbalance in the brain. It's like something's wrong with your knee, only it's not in your knee, it's inside your skull. And just like you might take blood pressure medicine because the chemistry is what you need, sometimes your brain needs a certain chemistry.
Right.
The trick is distinguishing between chemistry and experience. The alcoholic says, I need this drink in order to be happy, which is not true. The diabetic says, I need this insulin in order to be happy, and that is true. But that's a chemical thing, not an emotional thing. But
and one drives the other, because the chemical part will drive the experiential part.
Right. Yeah.
You know what I want to do is this has been a brilliant conversation, but you know what I want to do is I want to focus probably most of the remainder of our time on what I read when I read a quote from J.R., from The Fellowship of the Ring, J.R. Tolkien and Gandalf having a conversation. And they were calling their times, I wish I wasn't born in the worst of times. Yeah. And we are, I guess I could be overstating it if I say we're in the worst of times, but we are in bad times right now, especially, and I'm thinking not of our whole political structure, which is worthy of a discussion, but I'm thinking of the marginalized, the disenfranchised, the rejected people, and what they are facing under this kind of pressure of where they're totally unaccepted. And I know that this is impacting you because your poetry is altered. I have your poetry for the last, especially for me, noticing especially the last week, and last week and this week, your poetry is different. You once were the optimist, in the midst of real life. I mean, you weren't, were just happiness thinking. You were optimistic in the midst of real life. But I'm not saying that you don't have optimism, but there is a sense of struggle that is going on in you that I'm sensing in your poetry. Is that just me, or is that intentional?
It's very intentional. For the last 8 or 10 years, I've come to realize that I am not optimistic, but I'm hopeful. The political turmoil in this country is something that I'm not optimistic about because I see signs of an authoritarian regime and I don't see signs of going in a different direction. Some protests have arisen. I don't know the effect that they will have, but I certainly don't have optimism. I don't have this sense that this is all going to work out okay. But even on a bigger scale, we have a couple of years, at most, scientists say, to make dramatic changes in how we use our resources before it's too late to do anything about climate change. And this administration is only going to make climate change worse. And
yes. I believe climate change is done. It's a done deal.
It's going to be too late to turn the corner.
Yeah.
And so this isn't going to happen overnight, but I'm thinking of the end times, that sometime in this next century, civilization that we know it has a good chance of collapsing. Okay, if that's true, how do we live well in the end times? How do we accept that sooner or later things go bad and we still live well?
What do you mean by live well?
Well, I mean both live for me with love. That's what it means to me to live well, to live with love, and also to be hopeful. And people always furrow their brows when I say I'm not optimistic, but I'm hopeful. Optimism is confidence in a future outcome. Hope is trust in something that's already there, but we can't see. And that's why I say my hope is in God. My hope is not in any human being of any political sort or any scientific breakthrough or whatever. My hope is in the power of human beings to be loving that's given to us by God. That's where my hope lies. And we can be hopeful in that way up until the very end. We can live with love up until the very end. And some people have noticed that my writing has reflected a lot more of that, the struggle of how to be hopeful in discouraging times, especially these last few weeks. And some attribute that to the political situation, but like I say, I've been worrying about that for a long time. Part of it is the season of Lent. This is the season in which we face our mortality. And we acknowledge that, in fact, we do live in the end times. I'm about to turn 72, and I'm about to live out the last few years of my life. And maybe it's going to be 10 minutes, and maybe it's going to be 25 years, but that's where I'm headed. What if I acknowledge that? The power of the stories of Jesus on his way to the cross is that he knows he's doomed. And yet he lives with love and compassion and wisdom in the face of all of that stuff. And because he has wrestled through the Garden of Gethsemane, that he's been practicing ever since the temptations in the desert, he's prepared to do this, to say, even in the worst of times, I can still be loving and forgiving, and I can give my gifts, and nobody can stop that. And that to me is living with hope and living well.
I copied down a poem that I'm going to read a little bit of the poem, and it is your poem. I know that's how dare I read your poem, because I cannot read in the voice of Steve Garnass-Holmes. But you offer a poem, and I wrote this in my notes. You offer a poem of hope in what I'm calling the worst of times, and you write this: imagine the worst. And you say, go ahead, imagine the worst, losing what you have, even everything, the end of the world. It is only a matter of time, as it always has been, a moment away or a millennium, but always looming. But then you close the poem with these words, that I love these words, Steve. The world has ended, but there are people to love. Even in the end of times, there are always people to love. That is a hopeful poem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's what I mean. You know, that to me, I have achieved a much deeper sense of peace, accepting that maybe this is the end times and my job is to live with love. Then I can focus on living with love instead of being in that place where these might not be the end of times and maybe it's part of my job to save the world, and what if I can't? That's just anxiety producing. But to be able to remember that everything is passing and imagine that I've already lost it, then all I have to do is just love it to bits as long as I can.
I read a poem, or not a poem, I read an essay by Watchman Nee, and he said, let us not focus on what God is doing. Let us focus on what God has done. And it always comes to the cross. Mm-hmm. This is what God has done. God has prepared us for the end in the cross. And you know, I'm a powerful I don't call it Christologist, I call it crossologist. That, you know, I believe in the theology of crossology, that everything comes to the cross. And it's the love that occurs on the cross that you're writing of. Now, let me tell you what I'm working with, and I was, as you may or may not know, but you know, my early childhood until I was adopted at 7.5 was rather turbulent. I lived in a sort of abusive situation, not physically abusive, but lovingly abusive, and that I was given to other families to live with other families, and inevitably the other families, and they would be families of my my mother, who worked a graveyard shift, and my father, they were divorced. My father was an alcoholic who drank a fifth of liquor a day, so I couldn't depend on him, although his love for me was great. My mother's love for me was great, but she couldn't take care of me working graveyard. So I would live with these other people, and they would, after a few weeks, they would say, do you want to come and live with us for the rest of your life? And I said, of course, a real family, this is it.
Wow.
And then the next thing I know is I shipped to another family. And that kept happening over and over. So my mental issues that I continue therapy, 35 years of therapy, dealing with rejection and abandonment. And so I have taken the soul of not only where I identify, where I care for people who are rejected and abandoned, I identify with them. The rejected are me.
Exactly.
That is who I am. And so I, in these times, especially try to care for, especially the marginalized, which we will talk about, the immigrants, the deportation of the immigrants. It's beyond appalling. I may or may not be politically correct, but I don't care about being politically correct because I care about these people. Now, do I support illegal immigration? No, I don't. But once people are here, it's our role in our loving heart as Americans to take care of them. Because they want to work. They come here hungry. They come here in need. They come here in hope. They come here with a spirit of wanting to contribute and wanting to live a good life. And that's who I want to hope. But I have the far left, the progressive left, I have a political disagreement with. That wokeness and that sort of thing do not work for me personally. So that's another subject, but
we'll have to have a whole separate conversation about that.
and which I would love to have a conversation with you about that. But what I'm trying to do is I'm thinking of my acts of love, and it's I hate to say this, but it's easy for me to love the marginalized. It's easy for me to love the immigrants. It's easy for me to love gay people, trans people. It's easy for me to love the people that are rejected by society. But it occurred to me that I must also love those with whom I disagree.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean I have to agree with them, but I must love them. And so I'm working hard to love those I almost vehemently disagree with, especially when they believe as strongly as I believe in what I say. And so this is not an easy task. What do you suggest? How do I love those that I politically, sort of vehemently disagree with the direction they're taking? How do I love them?
A couple of things occur to me that Jesus teaches us. One is, I think Jesus is encouraging us to hold our own privilege really lightly. And like you were saying, I identify with the marginalized. Jesus is trying to invite us to identify with the marginalized as he did. And so all of his teachings are teachings about surrender of possessions, surrender of status, surrender of power. And those are, blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor, blessed are those who mourn. He's just hammering away at this, the blessedness of being on the margins, not because it's a good place to be, but because that's where your neighbor is. And the other thing that really strikes me is when the Scripture says, and the Hebrew Bible says, and Jesus says, and practically every religion says, to love your neighbor as yourself, I think Jesus really profoundly understands that what that means is not just that I love my neighbor as much as I love myself, or I love my neighbor in the same fashion that I love myself, but I love my neighbor as myself. I am, the neighbor is me. There's only one thing, and we're all a part of it. And I am part of my neighbor, and my neighbor is part of me. And this whole notion of us and them is part of what Jesus spends his life fighting against. You know, the one accusation they made against him that could actually stick at his trial was he eats with sinners. Absolutely. Because for Jesus, there was no us and them. I am one of them. Somebody comes up to him once and says, Jesus, good teacher. And he says, wait. Why do you call me good? Nobody's good but God. We're all in this together. We're all sinners. We're all beloved. We're all broken. We're all healed and redeemed by God. And when I see my neighbor as a part of this thing that I am also a part of, I can love them more deeply, even when my neighbor happens to be somebody that I think of politically as really wrong and even dangerous. I can still see myself as part of them, that whatever evil they represent, I'm complicit with that evil. Whatever fault they have, I have the same faults. And I have a different set of struggles than everybody else, but we're all in this together. And so I think both Jesus' encouragement for us to let go of our attachment to our privilege, our sense of belonging, which is really strong for me because I'm a fairly financially secure, straight, Christian, white male. I've got it all. And Jesus says, that's exactly what you need to let go of. I can't stop being any of those things. But I can be willing to be a steward of that privilege on behalf of the marginalized. And the other side of that is that becomes easier for me when I remember that the marginalized are me and those in power are me. So for Jesus, both the leper and Herod and Pilate, he could love them all the same, because he understood that we're all part of this thing together.
I love that. It is easy for me to consider the marginalized and disenfranchised as me. I can identify with them. I am beginning, not just on what you said here, but you have sort of cemented, I am beginning to look at those who are in positions, political positions, the very far radical positions that I disagree with. They are me. I am one with them. And you know, I've been thinking about the danger of believing that me and what I believe is right, and then almost non-negotiable. And I am not right because I go through my whole life and I've never been right. Why do I think I am now?
You know, our polarization is an autoimmune disease.
Talk to me about that.
Well, I'm a pretty leftist kind of guy, and the more I want to reject right-wing people, the more I have to take seriously that I'm rejecting part of my own body, the body of Christ that I belong to. So I can't reject them. I can't judge them. I have to live with them. I have to be kind to them. Otherwise, I'm just attacking the ecosystem of my own spirit. And our whole culture is doing that. Our culture is attacking itself. Left against right, blue against red, rich against poor, native against immigrants. And partly, I think that's how evil works. That's how Satan gets into us. The language of evil and the language of empire overlap for me. So when Jesus talks about Caesar, he's also talking about Satan and vice versa. And part of the way empire works is that those of us who are in charge are going to get all of you to fight with each other. And so you'll argue about whether these immigrants belong here or don't. And meanwhile, you'll let me get away with whatever I want because you're busy fighting with each other. And sin works that way. It gets me fighting with myself. And it gets our society that way. It gets us rejecting each other, like a body rejecting a part of its own self, like our immune cells going after our own body because they've gotten overexcited about their difference instead of saying, wait, you don't belong to them, you belong to us. We're all us. There's no us and them.
My next question was a pre-prepared question, and I think you've answered in so many different ways, but I think it's important for everyone to understand. I gave a speech at church a couple Sundays ago on the Trinity, and it's Bonaventure and the Trinity. And Bonaventure, for some reason, theologians have not paid attention to Bonaventure and the Trinity and the work of the Father, and he goes to Mark 10 is one of the passages of Jesus talking to the rich ruler, and he says, why are you calling me good? Only God is good. And Bonaventure begins by saying, before he is anything else, God is good, and then goes on to add that goodness is God's essential nature, and love is the fullest expression of goodness. Mm-hmm. Love is the fullest expression of goodness. And so in that, all that to lead up to my point was, I was telling the people, I am, I call it gifted with the gift of pondering. Mm. I can sit, it is not difficult for me to be contemplative. It is not difficult for me to meditate. And, I can sit, I have a chair in my reading room that I can sit for 30 minutes, even up to an hour, and not have a book or not have a journal, and just ponder. Mm-hmm. And you are a ponderer. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, what is it these days that drives your pondering? What do you feel yourself pondering as much or more than anything else?
That's a good question. I've been pondering a lot that word that you used, goodness. If God is anything, God is first of all good, and goodness and love is the manifestation of that. I think all of Jesus' teachings and all of his actions, all of his miracles, everything he ever did, his life, his death, his resurrection, all boils down to this 4 words. This is the entire thing. Get your pen out. Are you ready?
Okay.
Trust God, be kind. I think Jesus invites us to trust that God is good, that God is goodness, that God is kindness. We have these notions of God being vindictive or judging or unpredictable or even just a harsh taskmaster. And Jesus keeps on saying God is nothing but abundant goodness. And when we trust that, then we ourselves are good and we are kind to other people. And we can get lost in all sorts of definitions about what it means to be loving to your neighbor. But Jesus says, just skip the definitions and be kind. You know what that is.
Just being, and I put it another way because, kindness is my word. That's my active word in life. That's, if I were to leave a legacy, I don't care whether anybody remembers me, but they remember kindness, and they remember the kindness that I implanted in the world.
Yeah.
And not that I implanted it, that I implanted this, an aura generates, that I want to generate an aura of kindness. And what's that?
It's already there. The kindness is there.
Yes.
Again, like the wire that transmits the electricity, or the radio that picks up the signal's already there. All I have to do is tune into it. And I think that's what I ponder. I find myself more and more just pondering the innate goodness in life, even when awful things are happening around me. People are being shipped off to these concentration camps in El Salvador. That's just unconscionable. And I could really get depressed about that. But what holds my head up, what holds my heart up, is pondering the goodness in the world that outweighs all of that evil. Because it's been there for a long time. This isn't the first time that concentration camps have been around. They've been around all through human history, and the goodness is so important to stay rooted in, and to fill my consciousness with the goodness of life, the goodness of nature, the goodness of human beings, especially when they're not threatened, and especially the goodness of people who are threatened and remain good anyway, to just keep meditating on that, keep mindful. And like I said earlier, when I was talking about hope, that's my hope. I don't know what outcomes will happen in the future, but what I know right now is that people are good. We have huge capacity for terrible evil, but we are good.
People. I agree with you. I find I was with a group of people at a meeting last night, and I can be in groups of people. I become even more introverted in a group of people, but I force myself to introduce myself to people I don't know. If you're standing by yourself, or if you're looking like you don't have anybody to chat with, you're in trouble if I come around, because I'm going to be, you're going to be my first victim, or my fourth victim that I look for. That's very important to me. Now, I've given you have never written this or said this, but I've given you the title of elder, because we are in need of elders. We are a society, especially the white society, a society without elders, especially with families that, we no longer really have. We don't even have what do you call it, the close, intimate families, but the extended families. We don't have extended families, and so elders, they're just, that's where elders really appeared. Mm-hmm. Without those, do you see yourself as a role of elder amid the issues of our troubled country today?
I do, and it's occurred to me recently when I think, as I've talked earlier about, imagine that these are the end times. Imagine that climate change is going to really wreak havoc on civilization, and at some point there's going to be major collapse. What could I do about that? One thing I could do as an elder is pass on to the next generation what they're going to need to know when things get really bad, that they might have to pass on to the next generation. I'm going to die relatively safe and happy, probably. My children are probably going to have to suffer. My grandchildren are really going to have to struggle. That's my prediction. So what do I do as a grandfather to give my grandchildren what they're going to need 50 years from now to survive in a really changed world? And what they're going to need from me is everything I know They're going to need to know what I know about life. They're going to need to know about Shakespeare. They're going to need to know about Bach. What can I pass on to them? And it might be stuff like that you could look up in the library, but it's also my love, my hope, my goodness, my patience, my forgiveness. If I can model that for them and say, over the last 72 years, this has worked for me. Forgiveness works for me. This is what gets me through. Hope and humility and a good sense of humor. This is what has helped me survive for 72 years. I'm passing it on to you. I think that's our role as elders, is to pass on essentially survival skills and civilization. I was just thinking yesterday, I was imagining the science fiction stories that we read about time travelers and thinking, if somebody 50 or 100 years from now could have somebody from the present travel to that time, what would we bring to them that would be of value? And I think, all the information that's being erased, all the stuff, the current administration is going through all the government's websites and erasing references to slavery, for instance, and erasing our memory of history. 100 years from now, maybe somebody will have retained that memory. Maybe somebody will, and I think of how easy it would be to how easy it is to burn books, to erase websites, to do stuff like that. And I think, so somebody needs to memorize every word of Shakespeare and pass it on. Somebody needs to memorize all of Maya Angelou and pass it on to the next generation so that it can't be burned, so that it can't be censored. Somebody's got it in their head. And I realize there are cultures that have done that. That have lived on an oral culture over centuries, knowing that, I think about the native cultures on this continent and how passed on their wisdom.
That's where elders really exist.
Yeah. And the elders taught the younger generation, and it was all oral tradition. They didn't have the luxury of libraries and computer websites and stuff like that. They just passed.
I don't know if it's a luxury or a curse.
Right. Yeah. And I think maybe that's our calling as elders, is to be the ones who teach the next generations everything we know.
You know what I've done? My son is a professional baseball player, and he has two assistants that live. He's single. And he has two assistants that live with him, that he pays two different men to do two different jobs. One cooks, one cleans up the house and takes care of all of his stuff. I don't even know if the child knows how. He's going to be 33. I don't know if he even knows how to write a check.
Right, how to do his laundry.
What's that?
How to do his laundry.
Yeah. He certainly doesn't know that. And it wasn't that he wasn't taught that. He had to do, when we were in baseball, we did all of his laundry. He did his own laundry. He did those sorts of things. But that is no longer the story. But he gets like 3 days a month off, and he works 10 to 12 hours a day. So he just doesn't have much time to have a real life. But these two young men, they're 40 and 35, look to me as a father figure. And so I see them, they see me, although we've never used the word elder, but they would say they see me as elder. And you may be surprised, but you know what my role, I've thought about my role, and I've thought about, I want to be careful with men that age. You don't give advice.
Right.
It's just, but you know what it was our last trip there. We were there for 3 or 4 days. I devoted my time to listening. to just acute listening, not getting deeply involved in group conversation, but listening, and every now and then saying something when I thought it was appropriate. But the most part was just very active, acute listening with not just silence, but looking them in the eye when they're speaking, and caring about what they're speaking, and shaking my head, and seeing that I'm getting it. I get what they say. And I've got to tell you, Steve, those were a powerful 3 or 4 days. There was one of them, well, actually both of them, but one in particular, we became like twice as close. Mm-hmm. He began sharing deep information about his childhood, that he's had difficult times with his childhood, and doesn't talk a whole lot about it, but he talked very intimately about it. And I think that's because I was too busy not talking.
Exactly.
I was there listening to what he had to say.
You know, that really touches on what we were talking about earlier regarding power, that sometimes the power is not in what we can do, but the power that we simply make available by being present. You were present to those people, and the power inherent in their goodness and God's goodness in them did its work. And all you did was to simply be present. And I think especially as elders who are not caught up in parenting and careers and all that stuff, part of it is that we now are free to be really present to a world that desperately needs that. Loneliness and a sense of isolation is just like an epidemic. And I think a huge role of elders is to be profoundly, quietly present.
It's a big word in my life. Presence is a big concept in my study of the late medieval Christian mystics and my Buddhist studies. It's all about being actively present. I've even slowed my gait, my walk. My spiritual director is the abbot of a monastery, and he walks so slowly, and his intention is paying attention. His intention is not just to walk, that he's not in a hurry, but he's paying attention, and that's what I'm doing. And my wife says, "You're looking old. You're walking like an old guy." But then when we walk, I can speed walk as fast as she can, but then I slow my gait down, which troubles her immensely because she wants to get there, and I'm not in a hurry to get there. I leave early. I don't let calendars and deadlines get in the way. I try to make sure I'm early at every event, that I'm not trying to rush, so I can be fully present before and after.
Yeah, living at a savoring pace.
Ooh, why don't we close the show with that? Living at a savoring pace. Steve Garnass-Holmes, what can I say? You are the best.
Thanks. We're all the best.
I have on the show notes, I have links to your book and to your daily poems, and I have encouraged our listeners to invest just a bit of time from learning from a master. Thank you greatly, my friend.
You are welcome. Thank God.
Thank God. I also want to thank our listeners for tuning in to the next chapter with Charlie. And until next, this is Charlie Hedges signing off. Bye for now.